This German pilot parachutes to survive, and the moment he hits the ground he is surrounded by a group of women. They hold shovels in their hands, their eyes cold and unblinking. The next second, the shovels stab down wildly, flesh and blood flying through the air. The men watching from afar are left completely stunned. On January 18, 1943, the Soviet army successfully broke through the German blockade of Leningrad that had lasted for 17 months, but the once prosperous city had already been reduced to ruins, all railways destroyed, and supplies completely cut off. To ensure the survival of millions inside the city, headquarters issued a ruthless order: a railway stretching 33 kilometers to the rear must be built within 20 days. However, all the men were fighting on the front lines, and the only people who could be mobilized were women, the elderly, and the weak. 16-year-old Sonia was one of them. She had just been accepted into her dream music conservatory when the merciless war shattered her future. Along with hundreds of other conscripted women, she had barely stepped off the train when German bombers launched a violent air raid. Amid the flying dust and debris, some fell instantly into pools of blood, but the girls who survived did not retreat. Their eyes firm, their minds focused on a single thought: repairing the railway and defending Leningrad. They cut down trees on the spot and used them to build the railway foundation. Girls who had never done hard labor before had their hands blistered and bleeding on the very first day. Yet not one complained or backed down, because they knew that behind them, Leningrad and millions of people were waiting for bread and hope. At night there were no tents, so they slept directly on the snow. When hungry, they gnawed on a few bites of rock-hard black bread. When thirsty, they grabbed handfuls of snow and stuffed it into their mouths. German air raids became a daily routine, and freshly laid tracks were often blown apart in an instant. The girls could only rush in under artillery fire to repair them. Destroyed then rebuilt, rebuilt then destroyed, without a single word of complaint. One day, another German warplane arrived to carry out a fierce bombing run, but it was caught from behind by Soviet fighters rushing to the scene. After a tense chase, the enemy plane was finally hit. Thick smoke pouring out of its body, the soldiers burst into cheers at the sight. At that moment, a dramatic scene unfolded. The girls waved their shovels and swarmed toward the parachuting German pilot. And that is how the opening scene happened. The war had long since forged these young girls into warriors defending their homeland. In this way, through non-stop day and night labor, it took only 17 days to complete a 33-kilometer railway linking Leningrad to the rear. Although called a railway, it was really just two simple tracks cutting through forests and lakes. There was no solid roadbed, and in some sections the tracks were laid directly on ice. Despite its crude construction, during the harshest days of the winter of 1943, this ice-built railway became Leningrad's only lifeline to the outside world. With the railway completed, a new problem soon emerged. Train crews had been exhausted by years of war. As a result, headquarters urgently ordered that students be selected and trained, and anyone with even basic mechanical knowledge could board the trains to learn. Teaching them was a retired veteran engineer who needed support just to climb aboard. Under his careful guidance, the girls quickly met the requirements to operate the trains. The train commander was Lieutenant Fedorov, newly transferred from the Black Sea Fleet. When he saw that his entire crew were girls only 16 or 17 years old, he was instantly stunned. But this was already the best team that could be assembled. Soon, they received their first mission, transporting a batch of supplies from the rear to Leningrad. As the train slowly pulled away from the platform, a journey that could only be described as a death run officially began. A train cautiously moved forward along a railway laid across the frozen surface of a river. The tracks were laid directly on the ice of the Neva River, and as the train passed, the ice made chilling cracking sounds, as if it might shatter at any second. The railway, completed in just 17 days, was now facing its harshest test. Everyone held their breath, their palms slick with cold sweat. Only when the last carriage crossed safely did they finally breathe a sigh of relief. But the danger was far from over. Just after crossing the river, they were attacked by German forces positioned on high ground 5 kilometers away. Shells raining down like a storm, there was now no way back. Train commander Fedorov stayed calm under pressure and ordered the train to charge forward at full speed through the shelling. Fortunately, the tracks were not hit, otherwise the train would have been immobilized. At that moment, a carriage on the train ahead was shaken loose from its coupling. After the signalman discovered this, an emergency alert was sent out, and Fedorov immediately ordered an emergency brake, but the two trains were still rapidly closing in on each other. In the critical moment, Klavdia desperately cranked the brake wheel. Thankfully, disaster was narrowly avoided and the carriages reconnected. However, the train had stopped right on an uphill section, and at low speed the wheels kept slipping. The firemen pushed the boiler to its limits, building pressure until it was nearly bursting, yet the train still could not move. Thinking quickly, Fedorov led everyone to shovel a mixture of snow and dirt onto the tracks to increase friction. In this way, the train finally moved again, dragging along the recovered 2 carriages to the transfer station, loading supplies, and continuing toward Leningrad. They had to create another miracle and break through the open ground with the densest German artillery fire. To deceive the German gunners, Fedorov used his trump card, releasing massive amounts of smoke to create the illusion that the train had already been destroyed. But Sonia misunderstood and thought the train was on fire, so she crawled toward the engine under heavy shelling to put it out. As a result, the train wheels were blown apart, and with a sudden stop she was buried beneath a pile of timber. A repair worker had just stepped off the train to inspect the damage when he was blown away by an explosion, but stopping here meant certain death. Fedorov decided to drive the locomotive alone to draw enemy fire. He uncoupled it and kicked the driver, who refused to get off. Down onto the ground, Fedorov drove the engine toward the distance, constantly releasing smoke and acting as a moving target. The Germans took the bait, pouring all their firepower toward him. This maneuver bought the repair crew half an hour of precious repair time, but as he prepared to drive the locomotive back, a shell exploded nearby, and Fedorov was seriously injured and collapsed. As the engine drew closer and closer to the front train, Sonia, buried under the timber, regained consciousness in time. She struggled into the cab and woke the unconscious Fedorov, but he no longer had the strength to drive. And so, this honorable task fell onto Sonia's shoulders. Under Fedorov's guidance, Sonia activated the brakes in time, narrowly preventing a catastrophic collision between the 2 trains. After the German shelling finally stopped, Sonia switched the reverser and carefully drove backward. With Fedorov's help, they finally returned to the starting point and reconnected with the carriages. At that moment, distant explosions thundered, and flames erupted across the German artillery positions. They knew that was the counterattack launched by the Soviet Black Sea Fleet. Under the cover of naval firepower, the train finally succeeded in delivering the supplies back to Leningrad. Seeing the smiles on the faces of city residents as they received food, the girls felt that all the hardship and sacrifice had been worth it. This shipment of supplies not only solved the immediate hunger problem, but also brought hope of survival to the besieged city. But the success of the first mission was only the beginning. Soon, Fedorov received a new assignment, this time a top-secret operation involving a cyclotron. They were ordered to transport a train that appeared to be empty back to the rear. Only after boarding did he learn that this transport carried 2 items tied directly to the fate of the Soviet Union. One was the scientists researching the atomic bomb and the core equipment, the cyclotron itself. The other was 271 children of fallen heroes, all descendants of martyrs.
Если увидите, скажите, что мама умерла, а меня откопали.
Because the mission concerned the nation's destiny, headquarters issued a deadly order. Success was the only option. Before departure, Fedorov personally inspected the train, and one carriage was even equipped with an anti-aircraft machine gun. He knew clearly in his heart that this journey would be one of extreme danger. Sure enough, not long after departure, the train encountered a bomb planted on the tracks. Contacting the engineers would require waiting until the next morning, but they had no time to wait. If discovered by the Germans, the consequences would be unimaginable. So the train commander led one subordinate, braving enemy fire, and carefully dug out the bomb by hand, wrapped it in a coat, and slowly carried it into the forest far from the tracks. The crisis was successfully resolved, but just as the 2 were returning, Kaya realized her hat had been left behind nearby and turned back to retrieve it.
Датский, живой?
А то, и шапка на месте. Не за то батя сына бил, что тот играл, а за то, что он отыгрывался.
The train continued forward, but everyone understood that this was only the opening act. The real trial was still ahead. As the train entered an open area, familiar German artillery fire once again rained down. The carriages shook violently from the explosions, and the children covered their ears and huddled together in fear. Fedorov once again used the smoke screen tactic, thick clouds of smoke engulfing the train and successfully confusing the Germans, allowing the train to race through the open ground at full speed.
Тащи, собаки! Тащи!
Есть секунду, перезарядку.
Breaking out in a cold sweat, the train finally escaped the ambush zone, but before anyone could celebrate, another accident occurred. A coupling on one carriage suddenly snapped, and the rear section carrying the children slowly slid back toward the open ground. That area was under heavy German artillery coverage, and if it slid in, the children inside would have no chance of survival. Zoya quickly released the brake, letting the carriage slide backward at full speed, crossing the exposed ambush zone and entering the dense forest to wait for rescue. On the other side, the locomotive section made an emergency stop, and several scientists rushed over to inspect it. Fortunately, the carriage carrying the special cargo was completely intact. German shells continued to explode all around them. Sonia ran toward the front of the train to seek help despite the danger, but a shell landed right beside her. At this moment, a mechanic found a damaged coupling among the scattered train wreckage nearby, and after tremendous effort managed to repair it. Just as the train commander prepared to send the locomotive back to reconnect, a German reconnaissance plane suddenly appeared. The female platoon leader ordered the anti-aircraft machine gun to open fire in response, but it turned out to be a foolish decision. Not only did they fail to hit the plane, they also exposed the train's position. Fedorov immediately ordered the locomotive to reverse and reconnect the carriages to save the children, but the accompanying state security captain harshly stopped him, bluntly stating that the cyclotron and the scientists were the top priority, ordering him to abandon the children and move forward at once. On one side was a national secret, on the other were dozens of innocent young lives, and Fedorov was torn between the two, but he quickly made his decision. The children were the descendants of heroes, the future of the Soviet Union, and he would never abandon them. Seeing Fedorov defy orders, the captain immediately drew his gun, announced his arrest, and forced the train to move forward. At this critical moment, Sonia, who had just arrived, made a bold decision. She quietly removed the coupling of the carriage carrying the cyclotron, letting it slide toward the children. The captain was furious, but there was no way to undo it. He could not allow national secrets to fall into German hands, so he had no choice but to order the train to return and hand command back to Fedorov. Fedorov knew very well that going back meant certain death, yet he hesitated for not even a second. Retreat had never existed in the Russian spirit. He immediately arranged for the anti-aircraft machine gun to be camouflaged, then drove to the edge of the open ground and exchanged fire with the German armored train opposite, trying to draw enemy fire and mark coordinates for the Soviet naval gunners in the rear. But the first assault failed, and several soldiers were killed. Seeing the situation turn unfavorable, the train was forced to retreat back into the forest. After that, the firemen braved enemy shelling and continuously threw smoke bombs. Moments later, the train once again emerged from the edge of the forest. This time, the train commander personally joined the fight against the Germans. Tracer rounds from the anti-aircraft machine gun streaked through the air, pouring fire toward the German armored train. The brave Sonia rushed over to help load ammunition. Even so, they still could not shake the German steel fortress. The fireman releasing smoke bombs was killed on the spot. Seeing this, the deputy conductor shouted for the train to retreat back into the forest immediately. But at that moment, the train suddenly lost control. When a crew member got off to inspect, he discovered two wrenches jammed onto the wheels. It turned out that the newly added mechanic was a German spy, whose mission was to sabotage the transport of the cyclotron. After being exposed, the spy stabbed the crewman to death, then secretly climbed onto the locomotive, knocked down the driver with a shovel, and shut down the train that had just started moving. Just as he was about to fire a signal flare to guide German bombardment, the driver regained consciousness, knocked him to the ground, and the two engaged in a desperate struggle. The spy pulled out a dagger and stabbed wildly at the driver, who endured the pain and violently opened the steam valve, releasing a blast of high-pressure steam. In the end, the spy was scalded to death by the steam. At the same time, Fedorov's persistence was finally rewarded. Suddenly, thunderous explosions echoed from the distance as the Soviet Black Sea Fleet opened fire, shells crashing down like a tidal wave onto German positions. The armored train was completely destroyed under the barrage. Watching the blazing fire in the distance, the soldiers shouted in excitement, but the train commander would forever lie on the land he had protected. He traded his life to expose the enemy's position and enable precise strikes by his own fleet. In the end, the train, battered by relentless warfare, safely reached its destination, and the mission was completed. The nuclear scientists who disembarked safely looked at the cyclotron on the train, then at the line of war orphans with innocent smiles on their faces, and were overwhelmed with emotion. At that moment, They understood that these children were the Soviet Union's true and eternal nuclear weapon, the future of their homeland. This film is based on real historical events. The ice railway known as the Immortal Corridor was built from the flesh and blood of countless Soviet sons and daughters. In real history, this railway transported more than 360,000 tons of supplies and troops, 6 divisions, moved 540,000 soldiers and civilians, and carried over 3,700 railcars of industrial equipment, delivering bread and hope to millions of people in Leningrad. This railway may one day decay with time and be replaced, but the young women who shed sweat and blood on the frozen plains, and the heroes who sacrificed themselves to protect their homeland and its future, their radiant deeds and noble spirit will be remembered forever by history. I am a movie enthusiast. Feel free to subscribe to my channel, and see you next time.